It's a real pleasure to be here. I was saying at the beginning that it would have been lovely to be in person, and when we run into these technological challenges, that makes it all the more true. But we live in complicated times, and I'm nonetheless very grateful for this opportunity to share some of the work of the WHO Committee on the Governance of Human Genome Editing. I'm going to share my screen now, and hopefully everything will work well. So what I'm going to try to do today is really focus on a very small part of the report, and that's the part that looks at the values and principles that ultimately undergird the recommendations. So I will have a final slide that summarizes those recommendations, but the focus is really going to be on the ethical underpinnings. To put this in context, I think it's important to appreciate that the WHO ultimately published 3 separate documents. The first one is the Framework for Governance, and that's the document in which you will find much of the detail about the ethical values and principles. There's then a second document on the recommendations. And what's important, and I will show that to you in a few slides, is the ways in which there was a real genuine effort to connect up the commitment to certain ethical values and principles with specific recommendations. The committee was really sensitive to the fact that very often there are final reports issued that start off with all these laudatory statements about ethics at the beginning. And then as the document unfolds, there's really no obvious connection between some of what is said later and the supposedly foundational principles. So that work is done very explicitly in the recommendations document. And the position paper is really an attempt, if you will, to bring those 2 documents together. So I just wanted to explain that to you because depending on where your interests lie, you may be looking at different documents. Another thing that's really important to appreciate, especially in light of the previous presentation about the report that was issued by the academies, is that the mandate, if you will, of our committee was different and much broader. So it was specifically to look at scientific, ethical, social, and legal challenges of governance, but not only with a narrow focus on heritable modifications. And so our committee was to look at somatic genome editing, which means basically all of the cells of the body other than those which are part of the germline. Germline interventions, where you're looking at making modifications to egg, sperm, either their precursor cells or very early embryos. But this is work happening solely in the lab, in vitro, not for reproduction. And then work that actually has a heritable goal or objective because the alterations that have been made to the germline are intended to be passed on to future generations. So there's a reproductive intent. So as I said, our mandate, our remit was much broader. And then if you look more specifically, and I just think it's important to appreciate that this report, compared with a number of preceding reports that had been issued by different nation states, et cetera, really had to take a global perspective because that's what the WHO is about. So we were asked to identify relevant issues that would be important to a broad range of stakeholders. We were asked to ensure that whatever governance approach we adopted, that it could in fact be used at a variety of levels so that we weren't prejudging the context within which the tools we might develop would be used. It had to specifically be able to work in parts of the world that actually typically have had weaker abilities or capacities to regulate. And this could be as a function of local priorities, local resources, dollars, quite frankly, governance costs money, et cetera. And lastly, we really wanted to therefore be able to provide a range of tools and guidance that could be used by a range of stakeholders. And as I said, at all the levels, whether it's institutional, right up to international. So here is a slide which really summarizes the ethical values and principles that are entrenched in the report. And one of the things that's really important to appreciate is that there was a commitment to try to speak to both what are called procedural and substantive ethical values and principles. So the procedural ones having to do with how we were going to do our work and how we wanted others involved in governance to do their work. So what's the context within which you generate decisions? And then secondly, what are the sort of fundamental commitments that we think you should have as you work through the decision-making process? Now, in the limited time I have available, what I've elected to do is to focus on the first few principles to just give you a sense of the flavor of what it was that we were advocating. And I'll also then try to show how some of those commitments tie into specific recommendations. So first of all, if we look at inclusiveness, what you see here is a commitment to really look at a range of perspectives, paying attention to different social, cultural, religious beliefs, moral values, skill sets, etc. And one of the things that I think is really important here is to appreciate that this commitment really was something that was repeatedly emphasized by the membership of the committee, largely because there was, in fact, reasonable geographical, gendered, interdisciplinary differences amongst committee members. And so different committee members, differently situated, were constantly reminding us about the importance of paying attention to diversity and making tool or offering up, if you will, tools and mechanisms that would be of interest and of use to people with different starting points around the world. Another commitment, which is, I think, really interesting and important, full of caution. So as you might imagine, there was a lot of discussion about the precautionary principle. And this is something which is dealt with differently in different parts of the world. And some scientific communities are quite happy with this idea of the precautionary principle. Other communities are actually quite critical about it and whether or not it stifles innovation, science, etc. So one of the things what we tried to do here is to not be party to that debate, because all of our work was about trying to find points of consensus. What are the things we agree upon? So inclusiveness is obvious as a starting point. And here then what we said is caution. In other words, we think it's appropriate to have a cautionary perspective, meaning that you're going to actually at least attend to uncertainty and risk. And that in that context, you'll look to the balance of potential harms and benefits and think through in a particular social, cultural, political context. How do you understand those harms and benefits? How do you weigh those up? And we were especially attentive to this in the context of what we would call first in human trials. And that would be true whether we're looking at somatic genome editing or perhaps, depending on jurisdictions, heritable genome editing. So a commitment to caution. Another thing that I think is really important is this notion of fairness. And here I think one of the things we were really paying attention to is the difference between high-income countries and low and middle-income countries, and the ways in which there are resources, both in terms of research dollars, intellectual capital, capacity for governance, etc., that is differently distributed around the world. And so what you see there is an attempt to think about that. One of the things that's especially interesting here was we heard from a number of different constituencies, stakeholders during our work, and Indigenous communities that spoke to us spoke very much about a lack of trust, largely coming from a past where they report, and I think it's widely known and accepted, the theft of genomic information and data. And so in that context, there was a real effort to sort of say it's important for different communities to have a mechanism by way of which they can have. And so this is, I think, something that we were able to capture with this notion of fairness. The next one I want to speak
Linan får... Här.
Can someone confirm that my slide is still visible to the group? Can someone confirm that my slide is still visible to the group? Can someone confirm that my slide is still visible to the group? Can someone confirm that my slide is still visible to the group? Can someone confirm that my slide is still visible to the group? Okay, I can see the slide again. There's a fair bit of reverberation. That should be correct. Okay. So in that context, there was a real commitment to really broaden the understanding of justice and for it not to be narrowly about distribution of goods, if you will, but really about a certain kind of empowerment and a recognition that there is a role for communities to be dealt with in manners that would actually address long-standing inequalities, long-standing marginalization, long-standing discrimination, and that in that context, you needed to actually have a commitment to engage others in priority setting, in the distribution of its weapons, but also in terms of finding ways in which to move forward the science so that it would actually serve the overarching commitment and good. Now, what you see here is a summary of the recommendations that are found in that separate document on recommendations. I'm happy to speak to any of these afterwards in the Q&A, but what I did want to say at this point is that when our report was presented to the Director General, he officially endorsed all of these recommendations and indicated that action would be taken on all of these recommendations. And so, that remains to be seen how those will actually be implemented over time. But I can say that that was very heartening for the committee that had worked on this for a very long time. Now, one of the things I said at the beginning is that we were deeply committed to being sure that whatever recommendations we brought forward were anchored in those ethical values and principles. So I'm going to show you a couple of slides now, and think of them merely as illustrations. I don't expect you to be able to read those slides, but it's so that you know what you might look for if you actually try to access the documents I mentioned at the beginning. But if I take the first one on leadership, okay, so that was the first recommendation. One of the things that we said as a committee was that Dr. Tedros had really been front and center with the pandemic, constantly naming the problem of offering a global perspective. And it's really recognizing that at the end of the day, despite all the tools and mechanisms available to us in terms of governance, that what you need, amongst other things, is moral suasion. We have not done very well on that front with respect to the pandemic. I can only hope we will do better. But it is, in fact, about saying you do need leadership. And so with respect to that and respect to our mandate for somatic human genome editing, we said it was really important that the statement should address equitable access to the benefits of research and to priority setting. And that's discussed at length in our report. With respect to heritable human genome editing, we said that at a minimum, a current statement, meaning in 2021, should reiterate the earlier statement that was issued by the Director General in July of 2019, which was to say very clearly that it was not appropriate to move forward with research in this domain. And that statement was in part prompted by the of following in the steps of Jiankyu He, that he was just going to do it better in terms of the science. Our committee responded in the moment, gave advice to the Director General. The Director General issued that statement in 2019. And at the close of our work, our recommendation to the Director General was that he reiterate that statement. Now, this is the page that I alerted you to where I said, I don't expect you to be able to read it, but I wanted you to understand that each recommendation came with a clear statement about what's the purpose of the recommendation, what are the values and principles underpinning that, what are the actions that we think need to be taken, What are some practical considerations? And then there's a discussion. And the reason we did this with the recommendations is that we actually wanted them to be actionable. And so with respect to every recommendation, we actually also name and target who should assume that responsibility. So this with respect to the first presentation on the academies is concern about what might happen in different parts of the world. And that's with respect to the prospect, if you will, of the displacement or travel of researchers in this context. And so one of the things that we say very clearly and strongly, which some people might think as controversial, that do not have some kind of domestication state, what they should or shouldn't think, we're saying to go forward. And so we're saying that the absence of policy would preclude such research from taking place. Now, that means if a particular jurisdiction wants to do this research, they just need to put policy in place. And so that's a pretty strong statement. And the reason it becomes important is there is data presented in the report, but it's also available in other publications showing the map of the world and how many places actually just have no legislation, no regulations, no guidelines. And in some respects, that's not surprising. For example, in several low and middle income countries, this is not a research priority. You're not even going to expend the time, effort, and energy to have policy. And that's completely fair and reasonable. But what we're saying is that if you wish to go forward with research, you would need to have some kind of policy. And it's because of that you see the second statement that the WHO and other organizations should assist member states in developing or adapting domestic policy in the event that there's an interest in proceeding with some kinds of research. And I want to say really clearly here, I think that that's important in the near term, especially with respect to somatic genome editing. We are moving into clinical trials. We have seen things happen with respect to stem cell clinics offering unproven interventions as therapies. And there was a lot of discussion about how do we ensure that we avoid that with respect to somatic clinical trials. And so I think that that's really important for places that would like to see those trials take place in their jurisdiction. And here again, just for illustrative purposes, is the way in which that recommendation has behind it a purpose, a relevant statement of values and principles. And here you'll see more specificity, actions, and practical recommendations. And with that, I get to end exactly on time with the list of recommendations as a summary and reminding you that all of those recommendations are tied to the values and principles that the committee developed. Thank you very much for your patience, both with me, the content, and the technology.